EU-Japan webinar, The Green Transition in the European Union and Japan during geopolitical and energy market turmoil. So just after some days, COP27 finished, we would like to discuss today what has changed in the last month, in the last year with the energy crisis, or maybe should we put it in a plural form, crisis, taking shape after Russian invasion of Ukraine. So reducing dependence on Russia becomes a priority in Europe. And of course, this winter and in upcoming years, competition for liquefied natural gas supplies is also becoming a pressing option between European and Asian markets. And high energy prices put incredible and increasing pressure on households and businesses across the world, also in Europe and Japan. And in the short term, it would be very interesting and useful to discover and to discuss how challenging can it be to put strong investment into deep decarbonization policies in the short term, and in the end, how to reconcile the emergent and pressing security needs with energy transition long-term goals, and how to maintain at the same time industrial competitiveness and energy security. So today we would like to discuss how Japan and the European Union approach these twin or maybe even multiple challenges, and what can be the prospects for EU-Japan cooperation. And we will discuss these issues with our key experts, and I'm happy to introduce our panelists, our speakers for today's event. First, Juna Rima, professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy, University of Tokyo. Professor Rima has rich experience and previously also experience at Meiji Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan. Then we have with us Mark Ringel, who holds European Chair for Sustainable Development and Climate Transition at Sciences Po, Paris, France. Then we have Ms. Yukari Yamashita, Managing Director at the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan. And last but not least, Christian Eggenhofer, who is a colleague of mine for many years as an Associate Senior Research Fellow at SEPS. But now his main position is at the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute, where he is now. So before starting the discussion, I would like just to list a couple of usual housekeeping rules. So we would like to stick to about 10 minutes initial interventions from each speaker, so to keep maybe about half an hour for a discussion and maybe addressing questions from our audience. And I would like just to draw your attention that, as usual, we have this Q&A box where you can post all your questions, and I will monitor it along our discussion, and I will collect and pass these questions to our speakers. So without taking more time, I would like to give the floor to Professor Arima, and as well as we all observed during the last months with energy prices skyrocketing, the energy crisis unfolding. So how do you see the options, feasibility, possibility, the ways to reconcile energy transition with the current geopolitical developments, let's put so, and what is the view of Japan on that? Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Irina, for kind introduction. By the way, very pleased to see you, Christoph, to see Christian for such a long, many years. We have been talking a lot about energy and climate issues in Japan and Europe. And again, coming back to your question, I have just come back from COP27 in Egypt. So I have attended up to the end of the COP27 in Egypt. So, and then we are now talking about the green energy transition, and the purpose of that discussion is ultimately the 1.5 degrees Celsius target and so on globally. So we not only talking about EU and Japan situation, we need to look at a global situation as well. So I'd like to first begin with the impact of Russian invasion or Ukraine war to green transition. And as a result of the Russia's invasion to Ukraine and the global economic downturn is a high risk due to soaring energy prices as well as food prices. And a stable and affordable energy supply has become the top priority in many countries. And of course, climate change is regarded as a very, very important priority in such fora as G7 and of course COP27, which I have just come back from. But in reality, there are many events contrary to climate mitigation. For example, China, India, and other countries have increased coal production and coal-fired power generation since before the war in Ukraine. And rising rising natural gas prices in Asia is hampering coal to gas conversion in the Asian region, which has been regarded as very much pragmatic option for low carbon future. And even developed countries are busy dealing with soaring energy prices. For example, in Japan, we have decided to introduce gasoline subsidy. And recently, the government has announced that they are going to subsidize the fuel prices for, say, restricting increase of electricity prices. So, although the climate change is regarded as utmost priority, but what is happening now is not necessarily in line with our direction envisaged in the Glasgow Climate Pact. And while the G7 summit communique in Elmau made a very, very strong commitment to Glasgow Climate Agreement or Glasgow Climate Pact, G20 leaders' declaration, which was just adopted last year, is much weaker in terms of the language. And at COP27, emerging economies such as China, India, and Saudi tried to water down 1.5 degrees Celsius mitigation language. And also mitigation language in the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan has not gone beyond Glasgow. So that is why the Minister Sharma and EU Deputy Commissioner, the Timmermans, were very much frustrated with the outcome. And we also need to face the divided world caused by Ukraine war, and it could have a negative impact on global endeavor for combating climate change, which calls for truly international collaboration. And in addition, expansion of military expenses by Western countries could crowd out the necessary finance for climate mitigation adaptation. And since developing countries, NDC, say conditional to provision of financial transfer from developed countries. So this could hamper the efforts for further, say, reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. And developing countries could be also frustrated with somehow the double standard by Western countries, which are procuring coal and LNG by all means for their own energy security, quite understandably, on one hand, but they are at the same time discouraging fossil fuel related investment in developing countries on the ground that it is contrary to global emission mitigation. So this could further exacerbate the division of the world. So imposition of excessively ideological anti-fossil policy by Western countries could in the end strengthen China's influence on developing countries, and which is not the interest of many Western countries. And in fact, China is taking a very much windfall profit by exporting PV panels and batteries and EVs, etc., to developed countries, and exporting coal-fired power plants to developing countries. And they are now procuring cheap Russian oil and gas, and so that will further strengthen their energy security status. And China is, in many ways, taking very, very, how can I say, shrewd policies in terms of energy security and climate change. So our green transformation strategy needs to be discussed under that general environment. In the case of Japan, Japan has set a goal for 46% reduction by 2030 and a carbon neutrality goal by 2050, and is making green transformation a major policy pillar under the new capitalism policy under Prime Minister Kishida. And considering geopolitical risks, it is necessary to accelerate the green energy transition while securing stable energy supply. Japan is not connected to its neighboring countries by power grids or gas pipelines. It does not have any domestic fossil fuel resources. With regard to renewable energy, it also has a handicap due to mountainous land and also very much deep sea. Under such condition, aiming at carbon neutrality without nuclear power will significantly raise Japan's energy cost, which will have negative impact on national and economic security. And nuclear technologies are domestic technologies and accumulated by Japanese engineers over decades. So in this regard, Prime Minister Kishida's recent remarks are the first step toward normalization of Japanese energy policy, which has been say distorted by anti-nuclear fundamentalism and renewable energy fundamentalism. He said, we need to make use of existing nuclear power plants and accelerate restarting of existing nuclear power plants. And we should develop new nuclear reactors and also construct. So that is quite remarkable. But there are many challenges. Prime Minister himself should exercise his political leadership in securing understanding from local governments. And the consensus needs to be built within ruling parties. Nuclear regulation should be more efficient without sacrificing safety. And some policy incentives, such as regulated asset base in the UK, could be necessary for securing, new investment under liberalized electricity market. All of these call for Prime Minister Kishida's strong leadership and the injection of political capital. And of course, nuclear is not the panacea. We need to develop all non-fossil fuel options. And we need to develop and deploy CCUS technology and hydrogen ammonia, and also battery, renewable, everything. And it will be possible to achieve zero emissions by promoting mixed combustion of hydrogen and ammonia in thermal power generation plants, and in the midterm to long term, by using hydrogen as our only fuel. And hydrogen, ammonia, and CCUS technologies are essential, not only for Japan, but also for Asian countries, since their dependence on fossil fuel is likely to continue in coming decades. And given Asia will be an epicenter of incremental CO2 emissions in coming decades, early development and deployment and dissemination of not only renewable and energy efficiency technologies, but also such so-called transitional technologies to the Asian region is crucial. And I also would like to briefly touch upon carbon pricing, which is under consideration in Japan. And the government of Japan plans now is considering carbon pricing contributing to economic growth, which sounds a little bit oxymoron to me. But at Green Transformation Council in October, the government of Japan presented an idea that 150 trillion public and private investment needs to be made by 2030 for green growth. And of that 150 trillion yen, around 20 trillion Japanese yen will be financed with a so-called Green Transformation Economy Transitional Bond the government plans to issue. The bond would be redeemed with funds collected through the carbon pricing system. And carbon pricing would be introduced after economy is boosted with massive green investment, and the carbon price will be kept low at first and be raised gradually later. And in considering carbon pricing, I think both implicit and explicit carbon pricing altogether needs to be compared with Asia-Pacific countries with which, say, occupy the bulk of export and import relation with Japan. Since undue heavy carbon cost burden could cause carbon leakage from Japan. And European Union is now considering CBAM, and CBAM may also need to be considered in Japan eventually. Since Japan is export-oriented country, border adjustment needs to cover not only import, but also export. So in this regard, if carbon price is to be introduced, my personal opinion is that carbon tax will be more appropriate because carbon tax, carbon tax enables the export refund. So perhaps I should stop here, and very much looking forward to engage in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, June, and perfect on time. Thank you for these initial considerations. Now I would like to move to the EU side, and Mark, well, you heard like the initial ideas that were presented by June now, and in Europe, well, we have the European Green Deal, and we always discuss that it is kind of a strategy that to combine growth and clean transition. So in this year, in these months, has it changed? How, if yes, how has it changed, and what are the implications, for example, in particular for the external dimension of the Green Deal? We like to discuss this external dimension. So what are the implications, and how can we deepen partnership with Japan, for example, please?
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Irina. Thank you much, Ewan, for starting off the discussion. And pretty much, I mean, like Japan, the EU with the European Green Deal is in the logic of green growth. So stating the obvious, I mean, the Green Deal is pretty much an ecologic strategy, so leading to full decarbonisation. But at the very same time, and the Commission has underlined that again and again, it's an economic strategy aimed at growth. I think by the time now, and as you were saying, Irina, growth, I mean, that's a problem now. I think by the time now, I would like to add that pretty much, I mean, the Green Deal is pretty much the European contingency strategy against all the multiple crises that we've been facing over the last year. So we had COVID, we had rising energy prices first as effect of, I mean, supply and demand instabilities, later politically twisted. We've seen the weaponization of energy following Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. So that, of course, has had its impact on, well, number one, growth, but also certainly the way that the European Green Deal is seen and the European Green Deal is played. I think the good news is the Green Deal is still standing. And that is good news indeed, because, I mean, the sort of trigger reaction would have been to say, well, okay, let's put climate issues aside because, you know, we have supply security and that's more urgent. But no, the concept is intact as a sort of, let's call it Green Deal 1.1 or 1.2. So it's complemented by Repower EU to actually tackle and address the issue of supply dependence, getting us independent of Russian gas, which means in the short term getting back into fossil resources, but actually decarbonizing and using all the measures of the Green Deal at a much steeper pace and a much higher ambition than before, really. Now, the bad news is time is running out quickly for that. I mean, we understand these things, but we're not really good on acting on them, as my point or core point would be here. I mean, pretty much if you take a step aside, the Russian war in the Ukraine has been acted as a sort of fast forward. I mean, progressing us into a future of scarce fossil resources and the implementation that is having. And we can't say we didn't know it. I mean, I already remember from my time in the European Commission in 2012, when we did the Energy Efficiency Directive, I mean, we were actually selling it and promoting it by saying, look, I mean, just the saved imports in monetary terms is an annual GDP of Finland every year, which we could save and which would get us independent. So we've been knowing these things, but we've been not quick enough and sort of ambitious enough in terms of acting on them. And that goes, I mean, pretty much to the inside, so intra-Europe, as it would go to the outside. Pretty much, I mean, the Green Deal has its merits and has to get its praise, actually, because it reaches to points where earlier commissions didn't want to venture. I mean, usually, I mean, if we remember the energy union that said, well, let's do climate via the energy side, we address these 75% of carbon emissions, which are energy related. For the rest, well, to be seen. This commission goes much further by adding circular economy, mobility, agriculture, and transformation, sustainability transformation of that earlier commissions didn't want to touch. But still, that said, the Green Deal still rests too much, I suppose, on no regret options. I mean, who would not love renewable energy? Who would not love having longer lasting products, well insulated homes, etc., etc. I mean, that's sort of, I mean, motherhood and apple pie, you can't say anything against it really. But then when it comes to the implementation of it, so really getting it in place, that love is quite quickly gone. And I think that's what we're seeing right now when it comes to the legal implementation. So after a great head start with the European climate law, legislating binding climate targets, we're now in the phase when it has to be, well, there has to be delivery on these targets. So updated directive on renewable energies, energy efficiency directive, energy performance of buildings directive, and all of them actually linger on in the trilogues and have a hard time getting implemented and getting in place. So I think we still have some homework to do to prepare us what Yun has been pointing out, and what I would call an extremely difficult world to live in, which we have to actually deal with. And that brings me to the second point, actually, the relation of this Green Deal to neighboring countries. Pretty much, I mean, I would argue that the Green Deal is a sort of European concept conceived by Europeans for Europeans. Of course, it has its considerations. CBAM already mentioned in terms of getting the outside relations right, developing green hydrogen partnerships with our direct neighborhood. But well, will that be enough? I mean, if we really think it through, the Green Deal can be highly disruptive to our direct neighbors, and the attractiveness might be quickly gone. I mean, who says that actually the hydrogen produced in the MENA region, Northern Africa, would really be shipped over to Europe and see that partnership developing? How about regulating the different conflicts in our direct neighborhoods? So there are loads of actually conflicts and interests that have to be traded off and bartered off in terms of getting also the external dimension of this European Green Deal right. And here again, the argument would be, well, we know about these things, but in terms of implementation, we're lacking behind in terms of really giving it a go and really giving it attractiveness. And that is, which brings me to my last point for this introductory remarks. I mean, cooperation with Japan. In my view, this cooperation is extremely essential. 3 reasons for that. I mean, number one, as we've been hearing from Yun, I mean, we share the objectives. It is about decarbonisation. It is about green growth. It is about getting, a stable energy mix in place, which backs us up against all the geostrategic challenges which are around. And that is point number 2. I mean, the geostrategic challenges and uncertainties that we face are pretty much the same. I mean, coming from different sides and angles, but pretty much, I mean, the uncertainty which comes from it is pretty much the same for us. And number 3, of course, I mean, and that's, I suppose, the sort of biggest point in all of that, what's the alternative if we don't cooperate? If we don't coordinate and if we don't cooperate, I mean, the opportunity costs and the price would be really high. You can already see that when you just look again at Europe. I mean, in terms of quick reply to the energy crisis, I mean, you had pretty many European governments shopping around the globe for liquefied natural gas, uncoordinated, which actually meant that pretty many of them actually overbid each other, leading to rising prices. That was, well, stupid for the European governments, not good for the European Union, but, well, Japan, as largest LNG importer of the world, I mean, here again, it has global impact. So we've got a very good rationale in terms of negatives and positives to actually better coordinate and cooperate. We've got the cooperation agreements in place, so we have a very solid and strong basis. But in my view, I mean, much more could be done and they should be reinforced. And that'd be, from my side, just to name a few points, well, bundling research on renewables, energy efficiency, well, green hydrogen, but last but not least, also cooperating on the sort of next big game around scarce resources. Joining forces into circular economy, sparing resource use in terms of making the good use of that and actually seeing that we don't enter into the next sort of dependence. Finally, apart from these very concrete fields, policy cooperation and policy comparison. I mean, just before we went live, we talked a bit about energy efficiency policies and how Japan has been driven by Fukushima to actually go for very stringent policies to save energy. which is what we are doing in Europe just now. So there's a lot of mutual learning which we can and which we should apply. So there's a lot of room for cooperation, and we're well advised to use that. So with that, I think I'll leave it for the introduction, and back to you, Irina.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for your input. Now I would like to give the floor to Yukari Yamashita. I know you have the presentation, so maybe just like, could you share with us like what technological options does Japan consider on the path to achieving net zero, and what are the challenges that are lying in front of?
Thank you very much, Lina, for your introduction. I would like to use slides, but I may be repeating the points my previous speakers have already mentioned, but I think it will strengthen the point. Well, just to recap, this is since the 1952, the development of energy mix, the primary energy mix for Japan. You can see that up until the two oil crisis, we have been shifting away from the solid fuel towards oil, which is orange. And then oil crisis came, and then we tried to diversify our energy sources. One of the options was actually nuclear, and another very important one was LNG. Also we tried to keep using coal by importing them from outside. Then this shock came, but additionally, we also, as you mentioned, Mark, the energy efficiency has been very important method for us, pushing Japan to one of the best countries in the world with the high energy efficiency. The rule number one of diversification is not to only diversify the energy sources, but also from where you import. So it is a lesson for Europe, maybe, that without you being aware, you were dependent on one country. Up to COP26 in Glasgow, pressure to strengthen measures to address climate change increased. The emphasis on addressing climate change, only one of the three E's, the environment, energy security, and economic efficiency are the three E's for Japan. And one of them, climate change environment, was emphasized. So it was a driving force for energy policy making around the world. Japan faced a dilemma of not being able to incorporate one of most important clean energy solutions, nuclear, back to its options since Fukushima. The sixth basic energy plan had to negotiate with remaining limited options, such as further energy efficiency improvement, or bulk introduction of renewable energy, accelerating introduction of hydrogen and fuel ammonia, collaborating regionally and internationally. So we agonized that we have to pick up our target pick up our efforts to meet the target of 20%, 5% self-efficiency, picking up from the lowest 6% after Fukushima. And then also we wanted to add it a little bit to 30% by 2030 with our new plan. Another thing is that we try to reduce the CO2 emission by 45%, but to do that, try to save energy use, and also try to electrify as much as possible and make the electricity clean as much as possible. We have very busy slides here, but essentially what Professor Arima has told you is the strategy we have. We try to also introduce the hydrogen or ammonia, those non-emitting fuels into the future. But the challenge is already before the Ukraine for us is that the energy efficiency improvement in the plan was as vigorous as we have already exercised after two oil crises. This is 20 years between 1970 and 1990, and then our target is almost the same as this actual experience we went through after two oil crisis. But I have to lead your attention to this green line, where we have slowed down in energy efficiency improvement after 1990. So 20 years after 1990 was a kind of slow, because that is the period where we all enjoyed the lower energy prices also. So it is a hard fact that we have improved this much, and then we slowed down a little bit, and now we have to go back to that very sharp trend of energy efficiency improvement. That is the fact we have as the policy. I would like to draw your attention to the peak of the several peaks in the oil, the gas price. This is the Asian gas price, LNG price actually, and then it peaked back in January 2021. It was because we had a very severe winter, the very cold days, unexpectedly in January 2021, and then we had some problem with the thermal power plants. So the demand was very high, but then the supply was kind of shorter, smaller than we expected. Therefore, we had to look for everywhere for the supply of LNG. And it happened in the same way, same manner in Europe in the summer or autumn of 2021, when the wind didn't blow enough for Spain and UK. And so we had, we observed these spikes in European natural gas market as well. And then it influenced us because Europe started to look for LNG, and it started to import LNG from everywhere. So we lacked the LNG in the Asian market, so it went up also. And then the Ukraine hit. So the LNG price issue or natural gas price hike has been already observed before the Ukraine invasion to the Ukraine. The seriousness of this Russian issue is for Europe more serious than for Japan. Japan's dependence on Russia in energy is rather low: 4% on oil, 9% on gas, 11% on coal, in comparison to several European countries which are dependent more on Russia on these energy sources. So naturally, it is very different in sense that the direct influence of the economic sanction on the Russian energy, but we are still influenced, as you could see, globally from the global market. Another thing we are suffering in Japan is the retirement of thermal power plants. This is because of the liberated electricity market. Because of that, the free market, the competition has become more severe. The retail, the wholesale price of the electricity has gone down, and then many old inefficient thermal plants had to retire because they are no more economical. So we have lower and lower supply sources from the thermal power plants. That is the background. And we had the power shortage. I will come to that later. But basic idea of meeting the climate change the target is same for everybody: energy saving, and try to expand the decarbonized energy use. And then if there's any remaining fossil fuels, you try to capture the CO2, either before or after in the air. But we tend to forget there is this issue of non-electricity sector, non-power generation sector. We have to deal with them. Their CO2 emission is actually bigger than the power sector. So we have to find a way to deal with them, how to decarbonize this sector, non-power sector. And our idea from Japan is that we can actually utilize the hydrogen or even the ammonia fuels to decarbonize a little bit of these sectors by using these non-emitting fuels in the non-power sector. By using them, while keeping the same amount of the fossil fuel usage, we can still cut the emission like we see here. So we don't distinguish between the blue hydrogen or green hydrogen. As long as it reaches us, they are no emitting fuel. But we also have to notice that in order to have the blue hydrogen, we need to have the CCS or CCUS technologies. For that, we do have a room for collaboration. This is just to show you that the ammonia fuel has a potential of reducing CO2 emission from coal thermal power plants by adding them. Just by adding 20% of ammonia to the coal thermal power plants, we can reduce the emission down to the same level as gas-powered power plants. Therefore, we see that this is really a good potential for the transition period in Asian countries where new fleet of coal-fired power plants are abundant. To tell them to stop using it immediately and switch to renewables is just like fairy tale. They cannot really do it economically as quickly as possible. So they need to do the transition period, and then we have to pay attention to their needs. Another thing, I'm sorry, there's an animation, is that the circular economy, we call it circular carbon economy, just like the circular carbon, the circular economy, we can utilize the carbon also in terms of using the chemical or without chemical. If there is still the remaining CO2 discharged into the air, then we have to do the removal. For that, we need a collaboration. The technical development is still necessary so that we can reduce the required energy for that process and to cost reduction. So those are the things I would like to draw your attention, that we are concerned about the Asian countries, but there are other developing countries in the world who are in need for the means to transit towards the carbon neutrality. We don't deny that addressing climate change is real basic by now, but we need to find a way to address that along with the securing energy supply. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Yukari. Thank you. And it's a very nice overview of like available technological solutions and policy options in Japan. And it's very interesting to compare our notes. I think like our speakers will have like some comments. We will have a discussion later. And I have also a couple of questions maybe later. And now, well, moving to Christian. So Christian, you heard everything what has been said so far. And of course, like we have this new geopolitics, we have high prices, high energy prices. And in Europe, we are discussing whether like we are facing the risk of the so-called industrial meltdown. And in the end, like we always say that we need the strategic autonomy. And in the end, what does it mean in the current geopolitical context?
Yeah, thank you, Irina. And it's great to be with both institutions I'm associated with, SEPS and the EUI. I would like to focus not on industrial meltdown, but just call it reindustrialization. What can we do? And maybe, Yukari, one point, not the EU was completely dependent on Russian. It was a couple of member states, essentially Northwest Europe. So not everybody was sort of banking on Russian gas. But of course, you know this. Now, I mean, just a few initial reactions. The first is when you look at the European energy price outlook, the high energy prices will be staying for quite a while, a long time, and they will be much higher, double than the US at the best, and China. And so we were in a much more difficult situation than Japan. That has to be recognized. We are really, there is not much good news from the energy price front, if you wish. Now, obviously, this means short-term measure to stabilize the economy, to stabilize industry that is on its way. Every day there is new ideas, but it also means short-term measures to keep the EU unity. That's been, if you have a deindustrialization, then of course the unity will be much under pressure. No, but that's obviously not a substitute for a long-term strategy. So let me look at what Mark calls the European contingency. strategy. Now, I think we in the EU, we have really arrived what I would call the whatever it takes moment, you know, quoting the famous quote by then ECB President Draghi, whatever it takes needs to be done. Now, there is already a lot of fresh thinking, and it was mentioned already by previous presentations. We are thinking much bigger than in the past. Mark, I hope this, you know, you can agree, maybe not, but certainly there is an idea to be a little bit more radical. Or as June said it, you know, shrewd. We probably need to be a little bit more shrewd in developing our strategy, look where our strengths is, the weaknesses, etc., etc. And I think certainly there is more pragmatism than there was a couple of years ago. Yeah, maybe shrewdness. And I think we are doing away with a lot of taboos. You know, it was mentioned already, you know, suddenly we discussed blue hydrogen. It was a topic which was very difficult. So hydrogen is hydrogen, low carbon is low carbon. Biomass, biomethane is suddenly a debate again. We are looking at undusting the CCS directive. There is a CCS directive on storage. Suddenly this comes up. Again, we start understanding the sheer need of scale in terms of financing, in terms of material, in terms of energy, etc., etc. We are taking these numbers now much more seriously as we did in the past. And there is another, if I may use that term, a holy cow that seems to be slaughtered these days. That's really, we're thinking about massive injection of capital or money into OPEX. That was something which was not thinkable in the past. And that brings me straight to the US IRA. There is a lot of talk about how terrible our friends on the other side of the Atlantic behave, but maybe let's just take it a little bit differently, look at what they're actually doing, and maybe there is a few lessons in there. And one is already, as I said, you know, we need a lot of money to upfront investment. It's all capital intensive. We all know this. We need money. And that's what the US does. And that's what it does given the politics. And that's probably the only choice. And it will not go away. But when you look at the US, at the EU, what do we have? We have a high carbon price. That certainly is not something we should just sort of give away. Carbon leakage protection, June has mentioned this, of course, very, very important. But also the ETS is our cash injection. The auctioning revenues provide a lot of money to the member states if they then choose to use it for the right thing, not subsidizing lignite, but, you know, bringing this money into the future investment. Now, so what can we do? Just 2 points I would mind to mention, and then a third one where we cooperate very briefly. The first one, a no-brainer, more energy, more renewables, more electrification. It's very clear. Generation, permitting, land use, all these issues have been discussed along. Grids, member states need to start thinking about the European grids and not just the natural or local grids, speaking to my country. On the market design for electricity, I think it's a very, very rapid move from spot market pricing to long-term pricing. And that, I think it was really going at lightning speed, this kind of discussions. So electricity, electrification, we all know this. Now, the interesting part is really the future value chains. And there is where the future cooperation, I wouldn't say opportunities, I would say it's the necessity, you know, where the future cooperation necessity is, again, the sectors we know, renewable, hydrogen, storage, batteries. I think a huge success story for the EU, the battery alliances. Will there be electrolyzer alliances? Could imagine there might be sort of EU cooperation or with other countries. Semiconductors, we could argue raw material certainly is something. Now, let me here add the product substitution. You know, we always look at the old industries. Nothing wrong with that, but the future will be product substitution. There will be innovation. A lot of companies will invent new materials, new solutions. And there, I think, is really a good potential for more cooperation on innovation. And if not EU, Japan, who else? Now, the last point, most immediate, and June here, I come back to what we have been doing unsuccessfully 15 years ago, the global sectoral approach. For those who still know it, it is a benchmarking. We try to benchmark what is a good industry benchmark for, evaluating what should be done. So I think what we actually need, and this goes through all in COP27, every meeting on industry talked about it, we need a certification or a standard, a CO2 standard for green steel, green hydrogen, green cement, green chemicals, should that be possible, etc., etc. First, to allow for the uptake. If it's green, there may be demand. Public procurement is one of the instruments, but we need to know that it is green. Corporate procurement, there's a lot of demand from corporate side, there's in Japan very well for these green products. And then, of course, in regulation, you can regulate it into buildings, construction. Building, you can very nicely, very easily regulate this. So that, I think, would be an area for cooperation. EU, Japan, or Japan, EU, I should say, because the lead at the time was more from the Japanese side, less so from the EU side. Maybe G7, maybe we get it in the transatlantic plus Japan perspective. So, this global sectoral approach had some lessons. Now it failed. Maybe this time is different because, the world is very, very much different. I could imagine, Irina, the last sentence really, I could imagine we could link that to the CBAM. You get an exemption for green steel, green cement, etc., etc. At the moment, the CBAM is on pricing, which is a very difficult part for Japan. But if you do it on a green steel, that could be a much more operational and workable solution. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, and very useful and interesting points. So now I would like to open the floor for the discussion, and maybe immediately to follow up your last words about that we need global standards, maybe benchmarks, and maybe that can be done within the climate clubs or whatever you call it. And maybe I would just would like to ask you were listening to Christian, you were nodding. So would you like to comment on this? Because everyone is discussing climate clubs these days.
Yeah, and still, the concrete image of a climate club is not clear to me because Germany has proposed, and then it was supposed to finalize the basic idea of the climate club. But to my knowledge, it has not been presented yet. But one possibility is for climate club is to have such a platform for sectoral approach. And most important part is how to engage not only G7 countries, but also major players from non-G7 countries like China and India, because they are major players in such field as steel and cement and so on. And if we jump to the idea of CBAM immediately, then that could trigger a trade war between Western countries and China, India, and they are already beginning to unite it, arguing against CBAM. But if we start talking about data transparency of various sectors' carbon intensity, or the carbon pricing mechanism and so on, and without referring to the weapon such as tax or tariff, because globally, in particular, major global leading companies are more and more interested in procuring greener products with lower CO2, embedded CO2 emissions. So therefore, for companies, even in emerging economies, have incentive to lower their embedded CO2 emissions. So data transparency and disclosure, that could be a first part of such an sectoral approach, I think. And as Christian said, the situation has changed since we discussed sectoral approach 17 years ago. So I think there is a better chance. And also the G7 also proposed industrial decarbonization initiative. And they could also engage some non-G7 partners. So because G7 is not the center of the global emissions, not anymore. So we need to definitely engage China and India, but without stick immediately. So that is my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Yun. Thank you very much. Would any speakers would like to comment on this topic before we move a bit further?
Okay.
You can.
Okay, I was also involved in sectoral approach before, and I am aware that I think over a decade, the industrialized countries or OECD countries or bigger companies have already learned how to utilize that concept. Like they have already defined the how to collect data and which is the boundary of their operations, and then they are ready to share it in the public domain, which means that it is already becoming transparent data collecting and sharing approach. So our target should be how to collect data or how to define the boundary, and what is actually it is like a grammar of how to compare notes. So that kind of things has to be actually shared with the incoming newly industrialized countries and the smaller and medium scale enterprises, and then that part should not be kind of regulatory how to say the purpose the stick approach. It is to share the how to do that, how to collect data. Many countries don't even have the data collecting the skills or the schemes. So it is a very the time-consuming, painstaking the exercise, but that will be eventually effective because at the very end we try to compare notes on the NDCs, how much we have how to say not established have done. So it is a very basic. We tend to forget, but it is very important even for each countries or each companies to understand how much they have come.
Thank you, Yukari. Mark, so you wanted also to add?
Yes, quickly adding, but pretty much underlining Yukari's points really. I think with the present situation, I mean that well, if we can call it a positive side effect, not sure if we can, but I mean certainly one positive thing is that we have, I mean, gotten the sort of very strong message that we need to step beyond our comfort zone. And that actually the sort of limit where this comfort zone ends is shifted. So to that extent, I mean, it's promising actually to also work on data comparison, maybe also to use, and that's maybe another lecture of the COPs in terms of, I mean, deciding something, but then, you know, stopping short of really defining what that something is. Maybe it is about time to, I mean, also go for using our standard setting power, combined standard setting power, EU, Japan, G7, in terms of, I mean, taking the available standards and taking the available methods which are around and trying to sort of, I mean, push it into the system. So while I agree with June that and all of you literally that we have to reach out to the other economy because otherwise it just doesn't make sense. I think a first step into that direction would also to be coordinate among ourselves and have a sort of agreed standard which we then try to, I mean, propose at least for discussion to these other countries and get that into a sort of stepwise account, but really starting off with, well, clubs, coalitions, whatever you'd call it, who take the lead on certain issues, such as, for example, green steel, as Christian's been mentioning.
Thank you, Mark. Also, like before going a bit like more detailed questions, I would like also to ask our panelists maybe a very broad and very like $1 million question, like what do you think, what can be done actually to boost the demand for green industrial goods? Because we all speak, like Mark just mentioned, green steel and like other products. So maybe if Yoon and Yukari, you could give us also an overview, what are the discussions in Japan currently?
Thank you, Rina. And that is the most challenging part. We all know that green steel is very much environmentally friendly, but green steel is much, much more expensive compared with normal steel. And actually, the steel is steel, even though it is produced from, say, blast furnace or hydrogen, steel is steel. So unless there's a sufficient demand on such an expensive green steel, not only in developed country, but also in developing countries. And remember, the bulk of the incremental steel demand will occur not in the G7 countries, but in, say, emerging economies. And if there is no demand for such a clean but expensive steel in emerging economies, then who will invest in such technologies? So we are always talking about supply side, such as power generation or the automobile or others. But what we tend to forget is the voice of final consumers. So unless consumers are sufficiently willing to pay more expensive product, so long as it is environmentally friendly, then that kind of approach could eventually fail. So I don't have say right answer, and perhaps I think trade measures could be one option, but there is a big risk leading to trade war, as I said. And in the Framework Convention, there's a clear provision that climate policy should not be used as a disguised protectionism. And this is the argument which is already used by China and India. So I think before jumping to such a regulatory or punitive approach, we definitely need a dialogue with those countries. So it is not a perfect answer, sorry, Irina, but that is the dilemma we are facing now.
Yeah, that's indeed a huge dilemma. Yukari, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I would like to add, I am not going to talk about the green goods or product, but I would like to talk about the hydrogen. In Europe, because you have plenty of renewable electricity, you would like to establish the hydrogen, but so-called green hydrogen, the supply chain. Whereas in Japan, since we have nothing, we also have a problem with the potential for wind or even the solar is already almost exhausted because we have hilly land space and all the flat lands are already covered with the solar panels. So we are talking about hydrogen anyway. The blue is fine as long as it is attached with the CCS and then come to Japan, the CO2 free. Green, of course, if there's any country we can spare the green hydrogen with us, that would be also very welcome. But of course, the price matters. And then in order to have those two different colors together, there is one thing, the pink hydrogen or purple hydrogen from the nuclear. That is also expensive because we have to have the high temperature nuclear the plant to produce the high heat. So everything is expensive. But if we develop or establish the demand, the bulk demand, then the supplier will compete each other to eventually bring down the price. So the technological development is very important, but establishing a global market is very, very important. And also we have to mind that the supply chain will be kind of scattered around, not only from the MENA region or not only from the Gulf region, but also from Australia or Europe or North America, so that we have plenty of diversified sources and bulk of demand everywhere. We expect the Asian developing countries, which is the leader of the global development at the moment, need to utilize hydrogen into the future. But currently it's too expensive that they don't think about it. They think about jumping from coal to renewables. But that is actually just talking in head or drawing a picture on the desk. That's a dream. So we need to find a way to transit from the coal to maybe the natural gas, or in between ammonia with the coal, and then 100% hydrogen or ammonia. But that hydrogen has to be either green or pink or blue, no color. We need to establish the market. So that is also very important to think about the demand side.
Thank you, Yukari. Just maybe a short follow-up question. When speaking about blue hydrogen, yes, we need CCUS, CCS, carbon capture and storage technologies. What are like the stages of these technologies, like development, preparation in Japan? Do you consider implementing them?
Well, we first asked the Middle East to try it out. So we have already done the demonstration project with Saudi Arabia back in 2021 in the presidency of Saudi Arabia for G20. So it was a huge global experiment. But we also try to establish the CCS within Japan. We also have a demonstration site in Hokkaido, but a very, very small, tiny small. We do hope that we do have the site potential sites in Japan as well, but extremely expensive at the moment, and also it requires a severe monitoring. That we would like to start encourage the CCS to be started where it is easier to do, like a EOR will cover the cost, and then they have a big site in the oil producing countries or the gas producing countries, even the maybe coal producing countries. So starting from there, and then we hope that the technology of CCS capturing is expensive to go down, and it will become more available. Yes, Arima-san.
Yes, and one addition, and since Japan is, has a big neighbor like an ASEAN countries, and in ASEAN, Global CCS Institute estimates that there is a sufficient amount of CCS capture potential in ASEAN region. So that is why Japan, in collaboration with AREA, Economic Research Institute of ASEAN and East Asia, to establish Asia CCS network for sharing experiences and also do some, say, joint project and so on. So yes, in such a small country in Japan, the storage capacity potential could be limited. But if you look beyond Japan's border, in the Asian region, we could have much bigger storage potential. And given that almost all the Asian countries need to depend on fossil fuels in the coming decades, so without CCS technologies, that is utterly impossible for them to reach to carbon neutrality. So in this regard, we are looking at CCUS option not only for Japan and not only as a domestic technology, but we are looking at CCUS as say, very important component for Asian energy transition.
Thank you for your comment. And well, maybe we are heading towards the end, and maybe one of like the last questions. Well, I cannot avoid asking this. It's the elephant in the room: nuclear energy, nuclear technologies. Like in Europe, we have huge debates about whether to have it, whether to phase it down, phase out. So maybe like Marco, you are smiling. So maybe if like you could shortly comment on whether we could have like opportunities in future cooperation also, maybe across technology vendors.
Probably at a national level. I mean, the European level is always, and I was smiling because I'm commuting from a very anti-nuclear country. So Germany, I mean, decided with a phase out to a very nuclear country, France here, which of course, where nuclear is part of the key pillar of both the energy and the climate strategy. So there's a slide. I mean, every time I cross the Rhine, there's a slide. You know, different perspective depending on which side of the border you are. In terms of European cooperation, I mean, we have Euratom in place and there are cooperation agreements, but that said, I mean, the difficulty in terms of speaking nuclear technology from the European side is, of course, that, I mean, nuclear is part of part of the energy mix, and that is where actually the competence of the European Commission stops in terms of, I mean, promoting it, not promoting it. So that is really the prerogative of the member state. So I can certainly imagine a role for having a dialogue on advanced nuclear and nuclear technologies, as is pretty much already going on in different formats. I mean, the OECD format, for example. So that is around, and certainly there is a role for that. In terms of the European Union, European Commission pushing it, I would rather say no, because of the differences between the member states. But that said, I suppose there are formats around to discuss it and to see how to develop that.
Thank you, Mark. And would anyone like to comment on nuclear? Or please, you. I think you are muted.
Sorry.
Yes. No, again muted. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. And I fully realize that it is extremely difficult for European Commission to intervene in nuclear issues. As Mark said, the position of member countries are largely different. But you know, so I think Japan could envisage bilateral cooperation with European countries which are interested in nuclear options, and in particular, not only research and development side, but also policy side. And as I said, UK in the liberalized electricity market, they have set up some sort of policy incentive called regulated asset base to say induce massive nuclear investment under liberalized electricity market, which could be, generally speaking, very much challenging for such a huge investment with a long lead time. So, and you know, since Japan is interested in exploring constructing new nuclear power plant in the future, we need to prepare certain policy incentives. So we could learn, say, experiences from certain European countries. So, so that policy side, say, sharing information or sharing experiences could be also potential area for cooperation in the field of nuclear.
I just wanted to add to Jun's first intervention about the change in nuclear policy in Japan. The Prime Minister actually said the three things. One was accelerate the restart of the existing nuclear, and also the new and replacement of the reactors we have to explore that. But the third one is the extension of the lifetime of the existing nuclear. And for that, we need to share the experience with the other the countries which do have the nuclear power plants, as well as the decommissioning or the how to deal with the nuclear waste, and then the how to deal with the MOX or the spent fuels, and then the all these we need to collaborate so that we keep the nuclear option alive as it stand, as you said, Mark. And then the also we have to be aware that without these OECD countries and nuclear technologies, there are only China and Russia who are exporting furiously to the newly industrializing or developing countries. And then that is also something we have to be concerned about as an issue of energy security globally.
Absolutely, Yukari. And like, I think we have 5 minutes left, and today with us also my colleague Milan Elkerbaut. He is head of climate policy at SEPS. and has a rich experience working on carbon pricing mechanisms. So Milan, I would like just to invite you, maybe you have been listening attentively to our discussion, I hope, and to share your views, your thoughts, and maybe your takeaways from the discussion today.
Yes, thank you very much, Irina, and thanks for moderating this fascinating discussion. It was really great to hear from so many deeply knowledgeable people. Just a few reflections on what we heard over the past hour and a bit. I mean, Mark rightfully said that the EU and Japan should really cooperate, that it's really necessary to compare our respective climate and energy policies and learn from each other. So also with this webinar, we try to contribute to this mutual learning and exchange. Both our regions want to electrify as much as possible, reduce energy and resource use, and that involves hydrogen and CCS increasingly. As we deploy these technologies, we should learn from each other. It's not an easy thing to do it, especially at scale in a time frame of only maybe 2-3 decades. For hydrogen in particular, the flexibility is well known, but to produce it at scale without pushing up emissions really is very difficult. So both for the EU and Japan, I think geographic constraints will remain important as we move towards climate neutrality, and also things like where the CO2 storage is available will play a role. The EU has, of course, great experience with carbon pricing through the ETS, and now that Japan is developing this GX leak, I think there's a lot of things to be learned from each other. That's only can be a good thing. Yukari mentioned that actually Japan is not just considering hydrogen and CCS sort of as a long-term solution, but also thinking about it more in a transitional manner. That might be a bit different perhaps than in the EU, and it will be also really interesting to see what the best strategy here is. Then from Yunarima, we heard the very important point that the world is in fact divided, and what industrialized Western countries are doing at home is sometimes also a bit different from what they ask other countries to do, like the developing world. And this might explain some of the tensions we also see at the COP27 when it comes to language on fossil fuels. Christian then made a very important point that domestic and internal unity is really crucial if you want to hold the course of ambitious climate and energy policy. I think that goes for any country. And when we are making comparisons with the policies in the EU and Japan, we should also not forget what is happening in the US. The Inflation Reduction Act is posing a bit of a challenge, but at its core, it is accelerating a lot of industrial investments, and countries beyond the US and even beyond Europe and Japan will be able to profit from that. Now, if we look at really productive avenues for cooperation, we also need to focus on things such as product substitution, sectoral approaches, and how we define green industrial goods. And the power of our very large markets in setting standards is important here. And this could maybe be a more fruitful approach on pragmatic ways that could lead to a climate club, rather than just focusing on the so-called stick approaches such as CBAM. And when we have such discussions among the EU and Japan, it's also important that we extend this dialogue to other countries and avoid perceptions, whether they are due or not, that what we think of as climate and industrial policies others see as more protectionist policies. So with that, thank you very much again for joining, and I give the floor back to Irina for the final words.
Thanks, Milan. And after your extensive summary, I just can thank our participants, our speakers today for joining us and for this very interesting discussion, very fruitful discussion. The recordings will be posted on YouTube, so feel free to rewatch it. And I would like to thank also our audience who joined us today in this live streaming. So thank you very much, and have a nice day. And for Japan, have a nice evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.